Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derick, and with me is Evan. Hello, sir.
Hey, how we doing, sir?
Pretty good. Let's get to this will be an interesting one because this is a subject area that you and I have some definite interest in. But we're going to look today at
And it's two
Genesis.
verses.
It is. It
That's
is.
a big deal.
Yeah, but I don't know that well, I guess we've maybe done multiple verses because we did the days in chunks. So that was a
Yeah,
few. But
that's fair.
yeah, since we spent what 3, 4 episodes on the last verse,
We
yes,
might as well do
this is
might as
something.
well do
Yes,
one with a couple.
yeah. All right. Let's read it real quick. Genesis 1:29-30. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. Now, this is interesting. This subject. So here we see God gives a command regarding what is meant to be food for humanity and the animals. Now, what are we to make of this? So there's a tendency for some to take this as a very much a historical claim regarding man. That for a period of time up until the flood, when God expressly commands man to eat meat, that man did not consume meat during this period. Um, in reality, we have no such evidence of this kind of a thing. In fact, we have evidence of the very opposite, outside of perhaps some sort of bipedal human predecessor.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, we have evidence of meat being eaten for a very long time.
Very long
Now,
time.
lack of evidence for a thing, of course, does not prove that it's not true. So it is possible, I guess, that there was a period of time where man, or at least some men, didn't eat any. Um, but most of the evidence we have would suggest the opposite of that sort of a reading of this verse. All right, so we might want to ask ourselves: does it make sense to really look at this verse that way,
Yeah.
with this strict historical perspective, rather than as being something more metaphoric,
Mm-hmm.
and a summary of human history, rather than strictly an accounting of history, or recording of it. So even if we were to do it that way, look at it as absolutely, yes, there was a period of time when humans didn't eat meat. You run into a bit of difficulty with some following stories. For instance, Abel's sacrifice. Abel's sacrifice, and it's worth recognizing that word means giving up something that would otherwise be used. That's what a sacrifice is. His sacrifice was meat, and it was accepted by God as being the right sacrifice. Whereas Cain's sacrifice was, in fact, the things that we're told here is for mankind to eat.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at Abel's sacrifice, one could say, well, it was a lamb, and that lamb wasn't going to be eaten, but it was rather going to be used for wool and milk, and that would therefore be in keeping with this idea that man didn't eat meat during this kind of time, but Abel could still sacrifice a lamb.
It's possible.
Yes, but then the parts of the lamb that were sacrificed would likely have been the udders or the skin, something
Mm-hmm.
that related to that. Instead, we see the sacrifice calling out the fact that Abel was giving up the choicest, the fatty portions of the meat. In other words, that which would be considered the finest eating.
Mm-hmm.
That is what he was giving up. Now, you could still, I guess, make the claim, well, that doesn't mean Abel would have eaten those portions. However, this diminishes then what Abel's sacrifice is. And we'll cover it in more detail when we get to it. But I think the key to Abel's sacrifice is that he was giving up the best of the best of the best of what he could have, and he gave
Correct.
that to God, right?
Correct.
So if we
Yes.
deny that Abel would have consumed the lamb, we take away some of the significance of that sacrifice and therefore the lessons we're learning from that story.
Yes.
So that I see as an issue. Another potential problem, and there's some more arguments, I suppose, against this one, would be Noah and the ark. He brought on a single pair of those animals which were unclean and 7 pairs of those which were fit to eat. Now, after he comes out from the ark, he does sacrifice to God. And so one could argue, well, that was why the increased, pairs of those that are clean, the clean animals. But I don't know that we're told of a single sacrifice. I don't know that he needed 6 extra pairs of every single one of those animals. Otherwise,
in order to sacrifice them, it was a bloodbath.
It was quite a massive sacrifice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One could argue that this was probably meant to be food on the ark.
Correct.
More likely. So, again, doesn't guarantee that, but that's a way of looking at that. So, even still, I guess some might want to reference and say, well, this is actually pointing to a specific moment in human history. And I would say the thing we should probably look and say is, okay, maybe, but we have so much evidence and so much to argue against that, even just from a story perspective of you diminishing the later stories in order to make a claim that this is defining some material point in time in history. It's probably worth considering if there's a better explanation for why it says this, why it is described this way.
Can I have one more contention that might devoid this of history? It says, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit you shall have for them." Not every plant is edible.
Yes.
Every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth.
Yep, not everyone is
edible. In fact, the majority of things on earth we can't eat.
Right.
There's a very, very, very limited supply of things on earth that we can eat.
So I guess one would argue, we can eat the ones that, carry their seed with them, as described here, which, by the way, means no lettuce. So you're going to have to drop that for me.
Well, it's just every plant yielding seed. So every plant that yields seed, you can have it, and every tree with seed in its fruit. But they're still poisonous.
Right.
Berries. There are still things that would harm us if we were to eat them. So
it's
a small contention where it just says, does this have a deeper meaning than in it, or is it trying to record exact fact? And it's like, well,
so people would say, well, that's a result of sin, right?
Was it we've poisoned the food?
Yes, and okay, fine. We'll make some claims around that as we.
That's not explicitly stated, and in fact, there are naturalistic things that are explicitly stated in the curse to Adam around food, and why would that not be explicitly stated then? That's an easy one to contend against, because why would he say that you're going to labor all within the earth and toil in the dirt for your food, but wouldn't say, and some of it will be poisonous and some of it will, strike back against you in a more biblical way.
Right. And I think the other issue too is the idea that, okay, well, all of the animals were created, but then, the lion and the tiger, they didn't eat meat, they ate plants. Now, this would mean that when this changes, basically, God reaches into all of those kind of animals and completely changes their enzymatic profile in their stomachs. Because these animals aren't equipped to eat not meat. They don't have the enzymes in their gut that will break those down into the micronutrients that they need. And that would all suddenly have had to have changed in an instant, right? Mm-hmm. For this to be the case. And that seems, while I wouldn't suggest God's not capable of that, I just I don't know. I don't know that that seems to make the most sense
in this context.
Yeah, I mean, why? Why would God then have created this dynamic where, well, all of your historical evidence is going to point against this one thing, but we're going to make a historical claim here that that's what happened. And I don't think it makes sense for us to process it that way when we we don't really have much cause to look at this as being a description of the material, other than the fact that we live in a very materialistic society in terms of our thinking. I mean, I think it makes far more sense to seek for the spiritual truth that is being stated here.
Well, I think the contention would be that eating animals as opposed to eating plants is on the surface far more violent.
Yes,
that I think would be the argument that would be contended. And if this is pre-fall, that is somehow the violence inherent in I'm just trying to bolster the argument that violence.
But God doesn't give man meat to eat until after Noah, and correct. That was when, before Noah, as humanity reaches its peak violence.
Correct.
So I don't know that relates necessarily.
I mean, I guess one could argue that it was a concession that Noah's. I don't know, that post the peak violence, that there was a concession that God makes in his creation. But that feels odd.
Yes, right. Well, all this leads to there's a lot of questions around viewing this as being somehow descriptive of some materialistic history, right? So I think we should let's just first consider if there's another way to look at this that might offer a better explanation. Right. So I want to highlight one potential understanding of this. Now, one of the perspectives we've highlighted so far is this idea of higher orders of creation and lower orders of creation. That's something we've talked about with man being above animals, God above man, and so on. And we've also highlighted the idea of the maturation of humanity as a whole. And I want to suggest that it's those two things combined that describe why we see what we see here. So it is the design of creation that things of a lower order are consumed by things of a higher order. So land is consumed by plants, plants by animals, animals by humanity, and humanity is ultimately consumed, after a fashion here, by God. In essence, what we exist to be consumed by God. Now, it's not, obviously we're not eaten by God, but we exist to fulfill and satisfy God. We exist for his glory. So what we see here, though, is if that is the chain of things, as things are meant to be, the lower provides consumption, or in a way it provides a level of satisfaction, or it supports. We could look at it that way instead of consumption. The things of lower order support the things of higher order, and within our creation, they are ultimately consumed by them. And I think when we get to the idea of death to self and life in Christ and all of that, in a way, we are consumed by God, right?
Yeah.
What we see, though, here in the description of this verse is man not yet in his place in that chain. That's what is being described here. Now, we might ask why, right? If we see man not consuming the thing that is just below them, the way everything else in that chain is meant to. Now, so we see in this verse, I guess, we see man not eating all of the plants, right? And still different than the animals who are told they may eat all of the greens. So we see man different, but not yet right in their place where they're supposed to be. And I would argue that the cause of that, the reason we see it described this way, is this idea. Yes, the maturity of man.
So your argument is that they need to mature into the position in which they are consuming.
Yes.
The thing that is immediately below them.
yeah, we see man here as being not yet ripe enough to be consumed by God, if you will, where they still need to ripen up, and therefore not yet worthy of consuming animals, right? The other things in the chain are where they need to be to consume the thing below them. But humanity is not yet where they need to be to consume the thing below them. So they need to mature in a way, if you will. So this is there's all symbolic representation. You see what I'm saying, rather than like a specific period of time. And just to wrap it up real quick, after Noah, we see humanity, we've talked about this before, is that being sort of a point of maturation. And we see that at that point, God saying, you're now ready to be consumed by me, which he almost does that in a way in the flood, right? He gets rid of that which is not fit to consume and preserves Noah and his family, that which is ready to be consumed by him. And because humanity has now reached that point in their maturity, they're able to rightfully take their place in this chain. And thus he says, you may eat animals, for one, and two, he actually gives to them the process of this, like, pulling out the bad fruit from the good one, because he also gives you the command that, you know, now if man spills man's blood, by man his blood shall be spilled, right? Which is not what is said to Cain, obviously. So we see two things there that sort of mark the maturity of man reaching this new point, and that then we can go back to this point in Genesis 1 and see that this is talking about man not being mature enough to yet take their place in this chain.
There's something inherent in plants that would suggest that, and what strikes me as immediately interesting about this is that plants are stationary, and that in order to eat a plant, you simply have to find it. And it doesn't, I mean, aside from some small protections that it might have, it doesn't fight back. Right. Whereas it does require some degree of sophistication to be able to hunt. It requires sophistication to find proper plants, but it requires an even greater level of skill, I guess, would be in order to kill an animal and to be able to take over it in that way. So that would contend that is something that is something that is available for food, but not given as food. Because what is something that can sustain you, that you can find and not have any difficulty consuming? Well, plants. Right. What is something that requires even more effort? Well, hunting an animal. And you see this with agriculture and the development of agriculture. If you look at prehistoric man, and as they're developing agriculture, they're faced with this decision of, well, do I take the risk of going out and trying to fight and take over a particular animal in order to get a very, very large benefit from it? People tend to like meat better than they like just grain by itself. Or do I take the time to plant things? This is in a farming context, or even gather things, which is a little bit easier than hunting for something that's more secure and more sure, but is not going to be as satisfactory. And so this is the decision that confronted prehistoric people well before agriculture, or even as agriculture is coming along. And so I think it's interesting. It does require a great deal of strength and ability in order to hunt properly. And tribal societies respected their great hunters because of that.
Well, and
it was an honored position.
And being able to participate in the hunt was a marker of maturation.
Yes.
Too. It played a big role in that.
Right.
And so, in a sense, we see that here. You know, the idea that, well, now you can consume meat. It's matured, and actually, God does describe animals having fear of you, and so you will have to hunt them, basically. But he's saying you're now mature enough to be in that chain. And I think it's sort of fitting that comes, man's ability to consume animals comes around a time where God has harvested man in a way, right? If we look at the flood is in a way God harvesting Noah and his family and getting rid of the bad harvest. So we can sort of see all of that there. But okay,
interesting.
Well, so again, this is I think this means more as this symbolic representation. And I think this is, again, how we should really look at this. The same as with the Abel story, by the way, and not look at really any of these things as being meant to describe the precise culinary practices of humans, but rather the culinary elements are symbolic in this story of describing the state of humanity at these particular points in time.
It's reasonable. That's reasonable.
It's perhaps a way to square that with modern, scientific research and evidence and understanding. But again, perhaps
I don't think believers have an issue with that in other contexts. For instance, Christ describing himself as the bread of life.
Right.
I don't know if many believers would have issues, and I do know that that in translations oftentimes that's translated as a different type of food. It's translated as the staple to the native region a lot of times.
Yeah.
So I know in certain contexts he's described as the yam of life.
Yep.
And that's, I don't see many believers taking issue with that and saying, but it should be bread because it was bread that he used. And it's like, well, but is that the intent? Is Christ trying to say that I am, ground up and baked
if you've never
product
seen
of
bread,
grains?
Then what does that mean?
Exactly. So the significance is oftentimes deeper than that when it comes to these things around food.
Yeah.
That's reasonable. Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, with that, we'll move on, and next we're gonna just wrap up day 6 as a whole, and we'll do that next show. So like, subscribe, follow, comment, email unschooledtheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you then. Thanks.